Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Paul Auslander, president of SeaBridge Private Wealth. Paul, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Brittany. Thanks for having me.
It looks like we are potentially less than 24 hours away from a government shutdown unless Democrats and Republicans come together and strike some sort of 11th hour funding deal. But if that doesn't happen, all non-essential federal agencies will shut down after the clock strikes midnight. So to start off the conversation, as a certified financial planner, what do you think the implications of a government shutdown are?
Well, to your point, I mean, it feels like Groundhog Day. We've been through this before and we continue to be through it. And I don't think either one of the parties look good with this type of arguing going back and forth. Markets get roiled by these types of things. I'm concerned, frankly, that in the past they furloughed workers, but in this case, they may be firing a number of workers, people that they think, with the budget cuts that have already happened, DOGE, they may use this, excuse me, as an opportunity to get rid of people permanently. So the impact could be on unemployment. It could be in a number of factors. But I think the public's somewhat disgusted by this. They expect their leaders to do their jobs and get these things done, and they haven't so far.
And a lot of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, and government workers will be furloughed. They won't be getting that paycheck. As you said, the Office of Management and Budget is preparing for mass firings, which is different this time around than the historic temporary furloughs. And Republicans are blaming Democrats. Democrats are blaming Republicans. But if you're missing a paycheck, I've lived paycheck to paycheck for a decent portion of my life, and I don't care about the blame game. I wouldn't care about the blame game if my paycheck wasn't coming, if I didn't know how I was going to afford the roof over my head, how to put a meal on the table for my family. What do you think the economic impacts of potentially the mass firings, like you said, happening instead of just the temporary furloughs, which are devastating as well?
Yeah, I think the problem is that starts to creep up unemployment, right? We've been blessed with a low unemployment number. The more workers that get terminated, the higher that number goes. And I think the numbers that I've seen on the federal government level could be staggering. They could be very large numbers, which will impact services for quite some time to come. And I think that, again, that concerns both stock and bond markets. So yeah, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, it's not about politics for you. It's about finances and food. I just find it incredible that both parties think this is going to be a winning strategy coming up in the elections. I think the voters take it out on both of them.
Historically, government shutdowns do last just a couple of days, but we saw in President Trump's first administration the longest government shutdown, the historic 35-day government shutdown. So I'm curious how the length of these shutdowns impacts the economy. How much more devastating is it when the government shutdown drags on to perhaps a month opposed to just a couple of days?
Well, I think the obvious is the stock market goes down because people suddenly are scared and panicked, and whether it's in their 401ks or it's just their own savings, they stop investing, they start hoarding money. I mean, the implications continue along that line. People get into that fight or flight mode, and I just it's just not healthy, both for the economy but also for the workers. So yeah, I mean, there are broad implications on this. And one of the things that concerned me is both sides are really entrenched. They're really dug in. And you can see this in their lack of negotiating, right? That's the concern that I have. When you listen to President Trump and you listen to the Democratic leaders, there's no incentive on either side to compromise. So that could stretch this for a while. That's my concern.
And then what do you think the bond market, what do you think the stock market's going to look like immediately after, let's say there is a government shutdown, and each day as it ticks on, will it eventually normalize?
Yeah, interestingly enough, stock markets when you look at all of the really in the past 20 years, there's been three material shutdowns that have gone on for a while. There have been eight that have been minor. But the point is, after each one of those shutdowns, the markets rebounded substantially. So they do come back. They're elastic. Now, we have some other factors going on now. One of the concerns I have is the stickiness of inflation. So if you combine that, any of those numbers coming out with a prolonged shutdown, I could see that correction that people have been concerned about for a while. So far, people have predicted it and it hasn't happened, but that could be the trigger that brings it about.
Fed Chair Jerome Powell, he called this a turbulent period for the U.S. economy just last week. Inflation's ticking up, job growth is slowing down. Add on a government shutdown. I mean, what exactly does this do?
Well, that you listed, and I think Chair Powell's comments are spot on. You couple that with Ken Griffin's statements last week, talking about how inflation is still sticky and it's going to be an issue, and the inflation that we might still see from the tariffs, and all of those things could result in an equities market slowdown. The bond market, in addition, also you'll see interest rates have been coming down a little bit, which has been great. Mortgage rates have responded and come down, which has spurred the housing market. But that could reverse very quickly if this doesn't get resolved soon.
You mentioned something at the top of this conversation that it's almost like Groundhog Day. I mean, in the past couple of years, I can't count how many times I've had conversations about being almost on the precipice of a government shutdown. And then, obviously, what happened in President Trump's first term, most have been averted since. How fast does the economy rebound when a government shutdown only lasts a few days? Because as you said, it doesn't seem like any side is going to give in anytime soon. The vice president himself said he believed that we are headed to a shutdown.
Yeah. I mean, coming from Vice President Vance, looking at President Trump's attitude, listening to Leader Schumer, Jeffries, and Chuck Schumer, you can see that they're all girding for battle, right? And all want to look good in the eyes of their party. But I think they're missing the bigger picture, which Americans don't really care about that at this point. You've got the entrenched 20% on both sides of the extremes, but the middle, where I think the elections are going to be won or lost, are saying, come on, guys and women, let's get this job done. This is your reason we sent you to Washington, is to pass a budget. It's become more and more of a governing tool, right? Rather than do the budget in the way that it's been designed to do, make the appropriations, do the negotiating behind the scenes. What's happened now is it's played out very publicly in these types of threats, and I just don't think that's good long term.
As a financial planner, how much do politics get brought up in your conversations with clients recently? Is it more? Is it less? And has the government shutdown, trickled into people's conversations that aren't perhaps maybe super into politics? And are they asking, what exactly does this mean for me?
It's really amazing. When I first started in this business, very rarely did you talk about politics, religion, politics, something that didn't really come up in conversations, right? Now it's front and center. You have to be careful talking to clients and not tip your hand to where you feel politically, because that could be the quickest exit of any initial interview that I've had. So it's very prevalent with people. They believe their side is right, and the other side not only is wrong, but the other side is bad. And so in the old days, and this is a famous discussion, that Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill would fight like cats and dogs during the day, and at night they go out and have a bunch of beers and tell war stories together. That doesn't happen anymore. If they go out at night, it's usually armed. They're not friendly right now, and it's really sad. But that's the politics side of it. What I spend a lot of time doing with clients is talking about the economics of the situation, not necessarily the side of the politics. And I try to keep that conversation back to what their goals are and what they need for their money and what they need for their savings, and when they plan on retiring and how do they get their kids to college, and all the things that you would normally discuss, and try to keep the politics out of it.
And I think that this adds to the uncertainty that a lot of people have been feeling, whether it be with tariffs, now this government shutdown. And we could be having a very different conversation in 24 hours. We could be having a very different conversation in a week, in a month, depending on what exactly happens when and if a funding deal gets passed. The Fed cut interest rates for the first time in this year last week. How does that play, if at all, a factor here?
Yeah, I think it's a help, right? And I think the continued cutting of interest rates is something that the Fed seems to be looking at. I anticipate one or two cuts before the end of the year. I think if inflation and the numbers come back stickier and it stays at the level that it is, I think there will be less cuts than the markets anticipate, which again, it's priced into the market at this point. I think at least one and possibly two cuts before the end of the year. If that doesn't happen, I could see the market correcting.
And JP Morgan also agrees with you. They are predicting more cuts as well before the year's over. But the jobs report might not be out this Friday if the government does shut down.
Right.
How will that impact whether or not the Fed decides to cut interest rates next month?
I think they use that as a cover to say we don't have enough data to make a decision and leave it alone. I think that's one of the dangers of this impasse that's going on in Congress right now. You won't get those figures. That'll actually be a negative because I think there are reasons to cut interest rates at this point. Stephen Mirren, the newest member of the team, he's advocating an approach that's much more aggressive than all the other governors. There's very few times in Washington, D.C. that you get universal agreement on any subject, but there seems to be on that subject that the Fed's not going to be that aggressive, and they have a reason to stand pat. They probably will.
I mean, I am not in the business of predicting anything, but it does seem like there's a few options that could happen in the next 24 hours. One, Congress has a moment where they decide, hey, we're going to compromise, we're going to have a deal, we're going to fund the government. As of right now, as we sit here, and I know that things can change, we've seen that plenty of times in the past couple of years, that doesn't seem so likely. What seems a little more likely is that there is a government shutdown. So what specifically are you looking out for next, not only in the next 24 hours, but in the next couple of days?
Well, I think a lot of the damage has been done already simply by the threats and the fact that, again, we've moved into this period where you and your reporting and others in their reporting, it's a topic that everybody's talking about, right? So even if it gets resolved quickly, I still think, and you used this word earlier, chaos. I think there's worries about the tariff and how it impacts people's businesses, the government shutdown, all of this chaos, let's call it, again, without overusing that word, but it's pretty descriptive and it's apt, causes businesses to pull back. It causes consumers to pull back. We see it here. I live in Florida. We see it here in the real estate market. When things get scary like this and people aren't sure where things are going, they don't spend money. They don't buy houses. They basically stay almost frozen like deer in the headlights, waiting for these things to resolve. I think that's the danger here.
And I want to pivot now, and I want to pick your brain to something President Trump did post and float the idea a couple of weeks ago. This is what he said earlier this month on Truth Social. Subject to SEC approval, companies and corporations should no longer be forced to report on a quarterly reporting, but rather to report on a 6-month basis. This will save money and allow managers to focus on properly running their companies. What are your thoughts on that proposal of slashing the quarterly reports to now a biannual report?
Yeah, we're the envy of the world in terms of our markets. And one of the reasons that's the case is our transparency and the frequency to which we do that reporting, right? They're audited numbers. I understand the argument for saving some money and not having to do it as frequently to allow managers, CFOs, CEOs to concentrate on a longer time horizon instead of quarter to quarter. So I could see them compromising and maybe going the 6-month route, which is what the EU and the UK do. But frankly, I'm in favor of keeping it the way it is. It's an advantage that we have here in this country. When companies want to go public and they're based somewhere other than the United States, their dream is to go public in the United States because of the rule of law, a very well-functioning SEC, and this transparency that's created by putting those numbers out. So I'd be inclined to leave it alone.
And are there any economic impacts, do you foresee, let's say the SEC gets rid of the quarterly reports and then just makes them every 6 months?
Yeah, the cost of capital goes up a little bit. As you decrease transparency, your capital costs will rise simply because the folks providing that liquidity might ask for a higher interest rate because they don't think they have all the answers. It's just pure economics. So, yeah, it's worked very well. We're the envy of the world, as I've said before, and I think the idea of lengthening that period, while not devastating, I think there's ways of making sure there are quarterly reports out there that aren't audited, that aren't as full of work as the ones that come out now. But I think on balance, it's been an advantage for this country to operate this way, and I think it should continue.
Paul, overall in this conversation, words have been used like turbulent, chaos, uncertainty, and that's never good when you're talking about the economy. So when, if at all, do you foresee smooth sailing?
You know, it's interesting that you say that because we've noticed over the last few years, even in the face of some problems, complacency has set in. The one thing we don't have now is complacency because of all these things. This is the least understood bull market I've ever seen. There is so much money on the sidelines in money markets, people hesitant to invest, right? So I'm not sure that all of this derails this market. Economic conditions are still really good. Corporate earnings are up. People are working. Unemployment numbers are still low. Hopefully that continues. But I think markets, it has to be almost a cataclysmic event that knock markets off a bull run, right? And you add enough of these things together, and I could see something like that happening. I'm hoping it isn't, but there are a lot of hot spots in the world right now. There are a lot of issues going on here at home. I worry that we're playing with fire by having all this disruption. So while the chaos avoids complacency, I think you can get too much chaos. And I think that's the thing that's being threatened now.
Paul, I've had one eye on this conversation, one eye on my phone here right now, just in case there are any updates on what we're talking about, just in case this conversation gets outdated. As of now, as you and I sit here on Tuesday morning, it doesn't seem like the conversation's outdated, but who knows what could happen in the next 24 hours, the next 48 hours and on. But as we see developments with this potential government shutdown, I hope you can come back on and join me and talk about the economic impacts. Paul Auslander, thank you so much for joining me. You're welcome back anytime.
Thanks, Brittany. I appreciate it.